The Ardennes forest, December 1944. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The ground was not just frozen, it was as hard as iron. For the men of the German 5th Panzer Army, huddled in their foxholes near the Belgian border, the cold was an enemy, but it was a familiar one. They knew how to deal with the cold, and, as veterans of the Eastern Front, they believed they knew how to deal with American artillery. The rules of survival under bombardment had been constant since the First World War. It was a simple, grim equation. When you heard the scream of incoming shells, you had 3 seconds. You dove into the earth. You pressed your body against the frozen mud. If the shell hit the ground nearby, the earth would absorb the blast. If it hit the trees, you relied on your helmet. But as long as you were below ground level, you were safe. The geometry of the explosion worked in your favor. The shrapnel flew up and out. The foxhole was your sanctuary. But on the morning of December 26th, the laws of physics changed. The American barrage began at dawn, but something was wrong. The shells did not impact the ground. There were no craters. There was no comforting thud of earth absorbing steel. Instead, the shells began to detonate exactly 10 meters above the German positions. Not once, not twice, but thousands of times with robotic mathematical consistency. The result was a massacre. The explosions created a scythe effect, raining red-hot, jagged steel straight down into the open foxholes. The earth offered no protection. The depth of the trench didn't matter. Men who had survived 4 years of war, men who knew every trick of survival, were shredded where they sat, untouched by a direct hit, but obliterated by the air itself. German field commanders were baffled. To achieve a time-on-target airburst like that required a gunner to set a mechanical timer with split-second perfection, calculating range, wind, and muzzle velocity instantly. It was impossible to do it consistently. It was statistically unachievable. They reported to High Command that the Americans must have developed a new, terrifying radar system. They were wrong. The Americans hadn't built a new radar. They had done something far more terrifying. They had put the radar inside the bullet. To understand why an entire generation of German infantry was decimated in the snow that winter, we must step back from the battlefield and look at the desperate engineering crisis that birthed this weapon. The year was 1940, and the Allied powers were losing the war in the skies. The problem was speed. Aircraft technology had accelerated faster than artillery could keep up. Shooting down a Luftwaffe bomber with a standard anti-aircraft gun was like trying to shoot a fly out of the air with a rifle while blindfolded. The mathematics were against the gunners. In 1940, the standard anti-aircraft shell relied on a mechanical time fuse. It was a clockwork mechanism, essentially a sophisticated kitchen timer screwed into the nose of a high-explosive shell. The gunner had to estimate the altitude of the enemy bomber, say 20,000 feet. He had to calculate how long it would take the shell to get there. He set the timer, fired the gun, and prayed. If the timer was off by 1/10 of a second, the shell would explode 200 feet too early or too late. In the vast emptiness of the sky, a near miss was as good as a mile. The statistics were humiliating. British analysis showed that during the Blitz, it took an average of 2,500 artillery rounds to bring down a single German aircraft. Millions of pounds of steel and powder were being fired into the clouds, achieving nothing but noise. The British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment asked a question that sounded like science fiction. What if we stopped guessing? What if the shell decided when to explode? They theorized a Proximity Fuze, a device that would emit a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced off a solid object, a wing, a fuselage, or the ground, and returned to the shell, it would trigger the detonator automatically. It wouldn't need to hit the target. It just had to get close. Conceptually, it was brilliant. Practically, it was considered impossible. The electronics of the 1940s were not solid state. There were no silicon chips, no transistors. Electronics were built from vacuum tubes, glass bulbs containing delicate filaments, grids and plates. They were fragile. They were bulky. They were designed to sit in heavy wooden radio cabinets in living rooms, not to be shot out of a cannon. The physics of a cannon launch are violent beyond comprehension. When a 5-inch naval gun fires, the projectile accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second instantly. The force exerted on the shell is approximately 20,000 Gs. To put that in perspective, a fighter pilot passes out at 9 Gs. A car crash at 100 miles per hour generates perhaps 50 Gs. The shell experiences 20,000. At that pressure, soft metal flows like liquid, structures collapse, and glass vacuum tubes. They should be reduced to dust. German scientists had looked at this problem early in the war. They examined the concept of a radio-controlled fuse. They ran the calculations on the G-forces. They looked at their fragile glass tubes, and they concluded, quite logically, that it could not be done. They abandoned the project to focus on jet engines and rockets. But in America, a group of physicists led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism didn't care about the logic. They had a mandate from the National Defense Research Committee. We don't need a perfect weapon in 10 years. We need a working weapon now. They weren't trying to build a scientific instrument. They were trying to build a suicide robot that could survive the apocalypse of launch, wake up in mid-air, and kill whatever it saw. And they had to figure out how to keep a glass heart from breaking under the weight of 20,000 gravities. The solution to the 20,000 G problem did not come from a single moment of inspiration, but from a brutal process of engineering Darwinism. Dr. Tuve established a rule for his team at Section T. I don't want the best fuse. I don't want the second best fuse. I want the third best fuse. Because the third best fuse is the one that can be manufactured in time to actually win the war. They began by torturing the components. They took the standard vacuum tubes of the era and miniaturized them, stripping away the base, shortening the leads, redesigning the internal geometry until they were the size of a fingertip. But even a tiny tube is fragile. So they borrowed a trick from nature. Just as an insect is preserved perfectly inside amber, the engineers decided to encase the delicate electronics in a tomb of wax and plastic potting compound. The idea was that if the glass couldn't move, it couldn't break. The potting compound hardened around the tubes, resistors, and capacitors, turning the electronic assembly into a solid, unified block. It was ugly, it was heavy, but it was tough. Then came the testing. It was crude and violent. They didn't rely on theoretical models. They took their prototypes to a field in Maryland, pointed a 37mm gun straight up into the sky, and fired. They waited for the shell to fall back to Earth, dug it out of the mud, and rushed it back to the lab to see if the tubes still glowed. Most of the time they didn't, but slowly, failure by failure, the survival rate climbed. 50%, 70%, 90%. But the tubes were only half the problem. The real nightmare was power. A radio transmitter needs electricity. You can't run a radar set on hope. But standard dry cell batteries, the kind you put in a flashlight, have a shelf life. They degrade. If you put a battery in a shell, shipped it across the Atlantic, and let it sit in a damp ammunition dump in France for 6 months, the battery would be dead before the shell was ever loaded into the gun. A weapon that works most of the time is useless to a soldier. It has to work every time. The solution they engineered was a masterpiece of latent lethality. They created a reserve battery that was technically dead until the moment of firing. It contained plates of carbon and zinc, but no electrolyte. The electrolyte was stored separately in a tiny, fragile glass ampule in the center of the battery stack. It was a safety mechanism and a power source in one. The shell could sit on a shelf for 10 years and never lose power because it had no power. But the moment the gun fired, the violent spin of the shell, rotating at 475 times per second, created centrifugal force that shattered the glass ampule. The electrolyte was forced outward into the plates, and the battery woke up. In the 0.2 seconds it took for the shell to travel from the breech of the gun to the muzzle, the chemical reaction surged, the voltage stabilized, the vacuum tubes warmed up, and the radio transmitter came online. By the time the shell left the barrel, it was a fully sentient machine screaming a radio signal at the speed of light, hunting for an echo. By 1942, the prototype, officially designated the T3, was ready. But a prototype is not a weapon system. Now came the industrial challenge that the Germans had deemed impossible. It is one thing to build a single miracle in a laboratory with PhD scientists. It is another thing entirely to build 10 million of them using unskilled labor in a converted factory. The contract went to Sylvania, RCA, Eastman Kodak, and Crossley. The secrecy was absolute. It was categorized as top secret, a classification shared only with the atomic bomb. In fact, the Proximity Fuze project was larger in terms of manpower than the Manhattan Project for most of the war. Tens of thousands of women were hired to assemble the electronics under microscopes. They didn't know what they were building. They were told they were making parts for radios or medical equipment, or simply Device X. They worked in clean rooms with air conditioning, a luxury in the 1940s, because a single speck of dust or a drop of sweat could ruin the circuitry. Quality control was ruthless. If a sample batch failed the spin test, the entire production run of 50,000 units was scrapped. It was wasteful. It was expensive. It cost nearly $1 billion in 1940s money. But it produced a terrifying abundance. While German engineers were hand-soldering exquisite connections for their V-2 rockets, American factories were stamping out millions of disposable radar sets, packing them into crates, and shipping them to the Pacific. The weapon was ready, but the generals were terrified to use it. By late 1942, the United States Navy had possession of the most advanced artillery shell in human history, and the combined chiefs of staff immediately issued an order that sounded insane. You are forbidden to use it. The paranoia was justified. The Allied commanders knew exactly who they were fighting. They respected German engineering. They knew that if a single VT fuse shell was fired over land, failed to explode, and was recovered by a Wehrmacht ordnance team, the secret would be out. The German labs were perfectly capable of reverse engineering the device. If the Luftwaffe got hold of this technology, the results would be catastrophic. The Allied bombing campaign over Germany, the B-17s and Lancasters that were slowly strangling the Reich, would be wiped out. The invasion of Europe would become impossible. The risk was simply too high. So, a global quarantine was placed on the weapon. It could only be used where the evidence would be swallowed by the sea. The debut happened in the South Pacific on January 5, 1943. The light cruiser USS Helena was patrolling off Guadalcanal when a flight of Japanese Aichi dive bombers appeared on the horizon. The Japanese pilots began their attack run with confidence. They knew the rhythm of naval anti-aircraft fire. They knew they could weave through the flak bursts. But the Helena was carrying the first batch of Mark 32 shells equipped with the VT fuse. The gunners opened fire. Usually a ship would fill the sky with a box of flak and hope the enemy flew into it. This time, the first salvo didn't just make noise, it connected. The lead Japanese bomber didn't take evasive action because he didn't think he was in danger yet. Suddenly, a shell burst 70 feet away from his wing. The plane disintegrated, then the second, then the third. The Japanese pilots were bewildered. The safe distance they had relied on for years had vanished. The American shells were detonating with a precision that felt supernatural. It wasn't gunnery, it was execution. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, The Navy decimated the Japanese air arm. When the kamikaze attacks began, suicide planes hurling themselves at ships, it was the VT Fuze that saved the fleet. The smart bullet could track a diving Zero even when human reflexes were too slow. But in Europe, the ban remained absolute. General Eisenhower watched his men die in Italy and France, knowing he had crates of magic bullets sitting in secure warehouses in England, forbidden from being opened. The infantry had to rely on standard contact fuses. The artillery had to rely on the old math. The only exception was made for the defense of London. In June 1944, Hitler unleashed the V-1 flying bomb. These robotic cruise missiles were too fast for fighter planes and too small for standard anti-aircraft guns. They were terrorizing the city. Desperate, Churchill asked for the VT Fuze. Eisenhower agreed, but with one condition. The guns had to be moved to the coast, pointing out to sea. If a shell missed, it had to fall into the English Channel. The results were statistically absurd. Before the VT Fuze, coastal batteries were shooting down 17% of the V1s. After the VT Fuze was deployed, the kill rate jumped to 74%. On the final day of the heavy V1 attacks, out of 104 bombs launched by Germany, only 4 reached London. The anti-aircraft batteries were destroying them with a casual, rhythmic efficiency. The weapon was proven. It was a miracle, but it was still trapped by its own secrecy. Then came the winter of 1944. The German army, supposedly defeated, supposedly broken, launched a massive secret counter-offensive through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. American lines were overrun. The weather grounded the Allied Air Force. The situation was critical. Eisenhower looked at the map. He looked at the reports of heavy casualties, and he looked at the classified memos regarding the VT Fuze. The fear of the Germans stealing the secret was still there, but the fear of losing the war was suddenly greater. On December 19, 1944, a classified teletype message was sent from Supreme Headquarters to the field artillery commanders in Belgium. It was short, dry, and bureaucratic, but it was the death warrant for the German army in the West. Authorization granted for use of POSIT over land targets. Effective immediately. The quarantine was over. The box was open. On the morning of December 26, 1944, the sky over the Ardennes cleared just enough for the artillery spotters to do their work. In the American rear, behind the lines, artillery crews were busy. They were breaking open crates marked with special red coding. Inside, they found fuses that looked slightly larger, slightly stranger than the standard mechanical timers they were used to. They were plastic-nosed. They were heavy. The crews unscrewed the standard fuses from their 155mm howitzer shells and screwed in the POSIT fuses. They loaded the guns. They received the coordinates of the German troop concentrations massing for an attack near the Elsenborn Ridge. And then they pulled the lanyards. Downrange, thousands of German soldiers heard the familiar whistle of incoming heavy artillery. They reacted as their training dictated. They dove into their trenches. They curled into balls at the bottom of their foxholes. They waited for the ground to shake. But the ground didn't shake. The sky tore open. When a VT Fuze shell enters the terminal phase of its trajectory, it is sending out radio waves at the speed of light. As the nose of the shell points toward the Earth, those waves bounce off the snow and return to the receiver. The vacuum tubes inside the shell, those miraculous wax-encased glass hearts, detect the signal strength increasing. The electronic brain calculates the distance instantly. At exactly 50 feet above the ground, the signal intensity triggers the firing capacitor. The electric detonator fires. The main charge explodes. For the German infantry, the effect was apocalyptic. A standard high-explosive shell that hits the ground wastes 80% of its energy digging a crater. The shrapnel flies upward over the heads of men lying prone. But an airburst is different. An airburst turns the shell casing into a cone of supersonic steel rain. The shrapnel is driven downward. There is no defilade, there is no cover. The bottom of a foxhole is no longer a sanctuary. It is a bucket catching the rain. The reports from the front lines were horrifying. German battalions were not just stopped, they were erased. Entire companies were found dead in their positions, without a single mark on the ground around them. They had been killed by an invisible geometry they couldn't fight. Panic spread through the Wehrmacht ranks. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical destruction. Soldiers refused to man their positions. Officers reported that the enemy had developed a weapon that could see them. They called it automatic artillery. They called it witchcraft. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, watched the disintegration of the German counter-offensive with grim satisfaction. Patton was an old-school cavalryman. He believed in blood, guts, and aggressive movement. He usually despised the gadgets of the scientists. But after seeing the butcher's bill in the Ardennes, he wrote a letter to the War Department that would become the epitaph of the battle. The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. The gamble had paid off. The secret was out, but it didn't matter anymore. The German army in the West had been broken, not by superior tactics, but by a manufacturing miracle that turned the very air above their heads into a death zone. When the war ended 5 months later, Allied intelligence teams swept through the ruins of the German military-industrial complex. They interviewed the scientists, they examined the prototypes, and they asked the question that had haunted them since 1940. Why didn't you build it? The answer was tragic in its irony. The Germans knew how to build a proximity fuse. They understood the theory perfectly. They had developed the oscillator circuits. They had the blueprints. But they failed because of their own perfectionism. German engineering culture was obsessed with precision. They tried to build a fuse that was a masterpiece of electronics. They tried to build tubes that were flawless. And because they couldn't mass-produce flawless components that survived 20,000 Gs with a 100% success rate, they assumed it was impossible. They let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The Americans, on the other hand, approached the problem like a factory foreman. They accepted that 10% of the tubes would fail. They accepted that 5% of the shells would be duds. They didn't care. They just built 10 million of them. They overwhelmed the problem with industrial brute force and statistical probability. The Germans built weapons like jewelers. The Americans built weapons like Ford built cars. And in a total war, the factory always beats the jeweler. Today, if you visit a military museum, you might walk past a VT fuse without even noticing it. It looks like a rusty, unremarkable piece of metal. It sits silently on a shelf, overshadowed by the atomic bomb or the jet fighter. But make no mistake, that rusty cone is the grandfather of the modern world. The technology inside that shell, the miniaturized radar, the hardened electronics, the smart sensor, is the direct ancestor of the guided missile, the smart bomb, and the drone. It was the first time in history that a machine was given the authority to make a decision, to decide for itself when to kill. On that frozen morning in 1944, the German soldier shivering in the Ardennes wasn't defeated by a better soldier. He wasn't outflanked by a better general. He was defeated by a microchip made of glass, mass-produced by women in Ohio who didn't know what they were building, fired from a gun by a boy who didn't understand how it worked. He was defeated by the future, and he never even saw it coming. The proximity fuse was the #1 help. I personally think it was more important than the atomic bomb. Vannevar Bush, head of the US Office of Scientific Research and Development. If you have watched this far, you are part of the minority that understands that history is not just about dates and maps on a screen. It is about the engineering of survival and the terrifying ingenuity of war. We are dedicated to uncovering these untold stories, the psychological and industrial turning points that defined our world. If you value this kind of in-depth narrative, the most meaningful way to support this channel is to subscribe and join us for the next mission. I want to hear your perspective. Do you agree with General Patton that this funny fuse was the true hero of the Ardennes, or was it simply inevitable Allied industrial power? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for your time.